What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, Nick, Khamzat Chimaev came out and said he wants to get back to his old ways. He wants to fight in September at UFC Fight Night in Paris, and then he wants to turn it right around and fight at UFC 294 in Abu Dhabi. I think he's feeling the pressure because September will be 1 year since he's fought, and he's looking to stay active. You know, part of what made his rise so fun was that he was calling out everybody in all divisions, and he was fighting one weekend after the next. I think it was 10 days in between fights, and he's right back in there again. And now he's kind of cooled off since that war with Gilbert Burns, but he seems to be wanting to get back to the Khamzat of old.
Yeah, and that's music to my ears. You know, I'm one of those people that believes Khamzat when he starts to talk. You know, he's one of those guys that can get on the microphone and he says all kinds of things in the broken accent, and it's awesome, and it's, you know, it definitely pulls you in. But I don't think he's one of these guys that talks the talk, and then when he, you know, gets on the phone with his manager, he's like, actually, I don't want to fight this guy, I don't want to fight that guy. I truly believe that Khamzat wants to fight, you know, once every 2 months or once every 3 months and kind of be like how he was when he first got into the UFC. And, you know, obviously nobody at the top of the heap in the UFC is an easy night in the office, but Khamzat has made a lot of these guys look like easy nights in the office. And I believe that if he's able to get out of this fight in Paris unscathed, the UFC would give him this fight in Abu Dhabi and let him be on that pay-per-view card, just to sort of remind everybody exactly how game this guy is to fight absolutely anybody at absolutely any time, anywhere on the planet. And we understand with Khamzat Chimaev now, he's at a point where he doesn't have any easy fights. He's at a point where he can't fight anybody outside of the top 5, whether it's at 170 or 185. But I think he matches up well against everybody in the top 5 of both of those divisions. And as long as he's able to get out of that first fight unscathed, I see the UFC letting him do this fight on 294.
Yeah, and you know, his biggest issue so far has been the scale. He's had a very hard time making weight, especially 170. However, he still does feel that he can compete at 170, and he does have his sights set on the belt there and the belt at 185, in my estimation. Dana White has said he doesn't want Khamzat fighting at 170 anymore, but I'm not super bullish on that. I think that if he can prove he can make the weight, they will throw him in there. There's a lot of fun matchups. Obviously, the champion Leon Edwards has got some business with Colby Covington, it appears, is coming up, but there's some great matchups for him to be had there, and there's some great matchups for him to be had at 185. So maybe they let him do this little experiment, but the September card, they do it at 185, so he gets within striking range of that 170, and then he's able to turn around quickly because he's only got a month and some change to make that 170-pound weight limit. And if he gets to 185, he's at least in striking distance for, 5 or 6 weeks later to make that 170 mark. But I think the UFC is going to give him another chance to make 170, but I believe it'll only be one more chance. I think if he misses weight by 8 or 9 pounds like he did last time when he was supposed to fight Nate Diaz and totally disrupted that whole card, that will in fact be his last opportunity. But I do think they're going to give him one more.
Yeah, and I think anytime you miss weight, that is a bit of a blemish on your record, and everybody looks at it as like a cop-out or a way to just sort of game the system. But you have to remember, when Khamzat Chimaev signed to fight for the UFC for the very first time, he fought at 185, and then he dropped down to 170 only 10 days later. So I am not of the mindset that he can't make 170. He made it on about 9 days notice, and he didn't miss weight. He didn't have any troubles, no issues about it or anything like that the first go around. Now, I understand that he's gotten a little bit bigger. He's working on his strength and conditioning and getting strong. And just as a human in his mid to late 20s, he's growing for the last little bit of his life. But I truly think he can make 170 as long as you give him enough time. And people always want to point to that big miss, the one where he weighed in at 178 and ended up fighting Kevin Holland, and the whole card, you know, went to hell in a handbasket. I believe that that was actually planned out much before. And if you listen to what he said, he was like, I was ready to go. I would have died in the sauna. I would have died in the hot tub cutting that weight. The doctors told me to stop, and then they said they had a plan for me and they were going to switch some things around. That's exactly what they did. Personally, I'm glad that happened. I thought the fight between him and Kevin Holland was much more compelling and much more fair of a fight than him versus Nate Diaz. And, you know, the way the card shook out was sort of strange, but it was almost like the fights we didn't know we wanted to see, we ended up getting them. And while him versus Nate Diaz would have been a lot of fun, I know that would have been even less competitive than him versus Kevin Holland. So I don't really buy that he can't make 170. I think he could make it as long as you give him enough time and you don't stop him mid-weight cut, midweek of the fight.
Yeah, it was probably a situation where he was going to miss weight by a couple pounds, and the organization was like, look, you know what, don't kill yourself to try to get to 172 or 173. Just call it, because we have a backup, and that backup obviously is Kevin Holland. I mean, it doesn't take a brilliant matchmaker, and the UFC certainly does have brilliant matchmakers, to tell you that Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson is 10 times the fight that Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev is, unless you just really hate Nate Diaz and want to see him get beaten up on his way out. But I think it made a lot of sense for Nate to go out with a submission victory, him him and Tony get to have some fun. Obviously, Kevin Holland is a gangster. He didn't do very much in that fight, but he stepped up to fight him on short notice. From what I understand, he made a lot of money that night, so it ended up shaking out good for everybody. So I don't think that the weight on the scale tells the whole story. I don't think he really would have come in at 179. I think he would have probably missed weight, but it wouldn't have been so egregious, and therefore I do believe he can still make 170 pounds. And it'll be really interesting to see if they give him these back-to-back fights, because listen, that was what made us all fall in love with Khamzat Chimaev. If you check the numbers on our channel, he outperforms pretty much every other fighter that we talk about. There's a reason that people are wanting to consume content from Khamzat. There's a reason his Instagram has just blown up. There's a reason that he's on the tip of everybody's tongue in multiple weight categories. It's because he's a lot of fun, and part of what makes him fun is the activity, is the calling out of everybody. You know, he used to spar with Alexander Gustafsson, and he said, you know, he would have rounds with him that would make him feel like he's confident enough to beat John Jones, you know, and obviously Khamzat Chimaev's not beating John Jones, but a guy that's saying that kind of stuff is an exciting guy. And so I think letting him fight twice in the fall can get him back to that point that he was a couple years ago.
Yeah, and every time Khamzat Chimaev's in the news, it's something I'm interested in. And then even more so, every time he steps in the octagon, I get that big fight feel. You know, Conor on his rise up, he gave us that big fight feel. When Ronda Rousey went down to Australia and we thought she was going to win her fight against Holly Holm, those were big fight feels that we were getting. And, you know, they're more far and few between these days, but Khamzat Chimaev certainly is a fighter that delivers that.
No doubt.